أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So, a number of times we write a paper and our paper gets rejected. Now, there could be many reasons as to why the paper gets rejected. But I've tried to identify a few critical ones that leads to paper rejection. The first one is the paper failed the technical screening. You wrote a paper, you submitted it to the journal, and the journal always checks the paper before sending it to the reviewers, and they check it for plagiarism. Now they are checking it for plagiarism, and the plagiarism is above the limit. Let's say it's over 20%. So when it's over 20%, they will straight forward reject your paper. They are checking it for language. The language is not good enough. There are grammatical mistakes. There is lack of flow and structure. The language is difficult to understand. Your paper will be rejected. The format of tables and figures is not according to the journal guideline. So your paper will be rejected. So the important point is that before writing, or before rather submitting your paper to the journal, you should focus on plagiarism, language, format of table and figures, or rather the general author guidelines by the journal. If you're writing the thesis, obviously the same applies to the thesis as well. You have to look into what are the general guidelines by your department, because this is the first impression. And if a paper gets rejected by the editor, it is a waste of time, obviously, because they are not just going to, it doesn't happen that you are going to submit the paper, the next day they are going to read your paper, and the following day they are going to reject it. They might have a look at your paper after maybe 2-3 months. So if they are looking at your paper after 2-3 months and then rejecting it, then you are going to waste 2-3 months of your time. Next, the manuscript does not fall in the domain of the journal. You wrote a paper, you submitted it to the journal, and the journal rejected it. Why? Because it was outside the domain of the journal. The journal does not publish in this particular area. So what you should do is assess the scope of the journal before submitting your paper. The research topic isn't great enough or does not have great significance. For example, you come up with a topic, and after coming up with the topic, you search through the topic and find out that, okay, nobody has researched on the topic for the past, say 3-4 years. There hasn't been much on the topic in the last 3-4 years. Instead of thinking that, okay, there is very little research on the topic, why don't you think that it's of no significance? That's why people aren't working on it. It's not a good topic to research. So the point is, first of all, identify if it's a trend, if people are writing on this topic, if there has been enough publications during the last maybe 6 months or year on this particular area. If so, yes, this particular topic is of great significance, or it is a significant topic. Lack of clear identification of theory. So you have selected a topic, you have written on the topic, but you failed to select a proper theory to establish the relationship between your variables. You fail to identify what theory you can use or what theory you should have used to establish the linkage between the different concepts in your study. Now, failure to do so obviously will result in lack of contribution towards the theory. So if there is a lack of contribution towards the theory, obviously your paper will get rejected. You fail to properly identify the gaps and limitations. A gap is not something, for example, let's say there was a study that was done in America. And what I do is, I am conducting this study in Pakistan. So this is just mere a replication. This is just creating a replica of the study. This is not a contribution. This is not a contribution that, okay, existing research has assessed these relationship. Now, again, this is not a gap if you are just maybe changing the industry. For example, it was done in services industry and now you are doing it in, let's say, manufacturing or product-based industries. This is not a significant gap. This is not a significant contribution. What's a significant contribution then? If you include new variables, if you include new construct and assess new relationships that have not been tested before. Again, not just one or two relationship, maybe existing research, for example, if you have got 4 or 5 variables in your study, and in that 4 and 5 variables in your study, you are assessing, let's say, 6 relationship. And out of those 6 relationship, only one is new, and while the other 5 have been tested extensively in existing research. Again, this might not amount to a significant contribution in a very high quality journal. So try to find new relationships that have not been assessed before. The manuscript fails to highlight the contribution of the study. Now, yes, you have got a theory. Yes, you have identified the gaps clearly and you have mentioned this is what I'm doing new, but you fail to write the contribution of your study. You have to clearly mention the contributions of the study. What is it that you are doing that has not been done before? How are you contributing to the existing body of knowledge? Failure to do so obviously will result in the rejection of your paper. This is simply a repetition of what I've earlier said. Relationships have already been tested. Now make sure whatever relationships you are proposing, you check whether or not they have been tested before. How to get away with this thing? Now there might be obviously relationships would have been checked in existing research. What you can do is you can search existing research and find out if there are contradictions in the relationships being tested. For example, in one of my research, I researched on CSR and organizational performance. Now there is extensive research on CSR and organizational performance. But I started the argument with the fact that the relationship between CSR and OP is contradictory. Someone or a few researchers have said that it is a positive relationship, while others have said that it's a negative relationship, while some of them have said that there is no relationship at all. So there is a contradiction in existing research with respect to the relationship between CSR and OP. So there is a need for further research to conclude the relationship between CSR and OP. So if you are testing relationships that have already been tested but not extensively, try to find out, try to locate contradiction in existing research. Conceptualization and measurement not in alignment. So what do we mean by conceptualization and measurement not in alignment? The way you have defined the concept and the way you have measured it, they both do not sync with each other. For example, I've got a variable, let's say corporate social responsibility in my study. Now I've defined it as a higher order construct with 4 dimensions. Let's say the dimensions are business responsibility, or let's say the dimensions are economic responsibility, legal responsibility, ethical responsibility, and philanthropic responsibility. And the way I've measured it is that I'm only asking about philanthropic responsibility. Now the way I have measured it and the way I have defined it, they are not aligned with each other. There is a lack of critical literature review that leads to hypothesis development. This is again very important. What do we mean by critical literature review? A critical literature review does not mean that you are criticizing the existing literature. By critical literature review, we mean that you have to do an in-depth review of existing research as to what are the relationships that have been assessed, why there should be a relationship between these variables, how the variables are related with each other, are there any contradictions in existing research, lack of appropriate methodology. So you've used a methodology that does not fit the research design, or you have used a research methodology that is not appropriate. You have collected data from, let's say, respondents who are not suitable for this research. You are using an analysis that was not suitable for this research. This means there is a lack of appropriate methodology. The sampling technique that you have used may not have been appropriate. The questionnaire that you have used was not earlier validated or was not appropriate. There are flaws in procedure, presentation, or analysis of data. So the procedures that you have used, the presentation or the analysis of the data is flawed. There are issues in the presentation or analysis of the data. For example, you have reported convergent validity and the results were inappropriate. For example, you have reported discriminant validity and the results were inappropriate. For example, you failed to report the reliability and validity statistics. And finally, there is a lack of flow and structure. Your paper, no matter how good it is, no matter how good the contributions are, no matter how significant the contributions are, if there is a lack of flow and lack of structure, your paper is bound to get rejected. So these are 12 reasons or some of the main reasons as to why your paper can be rejected. Moving on. Now here are a few examples or rejection examples. So I have received a decision from editor on your manuscript with regret. I must inform you that the editor has decided that your manuscript cannot be accepted for publication in applied research in quality of life because it is focused on applied quality of life, is not strong. So the journal or the paper is not strongly focusing on the applied quality of life. That is the scope of the journal. That's why the paper was rejected. Here is another example. We did not assess or check the author guidelines. And that was in 2020. Here's another example. The problem was there with English. These are the different reasons or these are different rejection examples.